So you might enjoy hearing this anecdote. So my family has never done a family reunion. It's not a Cuban thing to do a family reunion where you get everybody. But my brothers and I decided to do one in the summer of 2022. And we gathered the entire family there in Miami, and it was incredible. And we saw everybody. And then we stood up to thank everybody. And I decided, not yet understanding what I was about to say to them, that I was have been invited to do this show at the National Museum. In the normal circumstances, when you announce that to your family pride, National Museum, well, it's like I drop a grenade at that family reunion.
Welcome to the MO podcast. It is our great pleasure today to welcome the artist Enrique Martinez Celaya. Enrique is an artist, an author, and a former physicist whose work has been exhibited and collected by major institutions worldwide. His notable projects and exhibitions include those at the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., the Museo Marino Marini in Florence, Italy, the Berliner Philharmonie in Berlin, Germany, the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Havana, Cuba, and the Museum der Bildenden Künste Leipzig in Germany. He has also selectively incorporated two-person exhibitions with historical artists who have been influential to his practice, including Albert Pinkham Ryder, Keta Kollwitz, and Diego Velázquez. His work is held in over 60 public collections internationally, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Moderna Musik in Stockholm, and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. Enrique is the first Provost Professor of Humanities and the Arts in the history of the University of Southern California and a Montgomery Fellow at Dartmouth College, where he's also a Roth Family Distinguished Visiting Scholar. He's the author of 9 books on art, art practice, philosophy, and poetry, and his work has also been the focus of several monographic publications, including 2 recent books at HTKants, Berlin, titled Martinez Celaya, Sea, Sky, Land, Towards a Map of Everything, and Enrique Martinez Celaya and Keta Kollwitz von den ersten und den letzten Dingen. In 1998, he founded Whale and Star, an initiative that explores social interaction and responsibility, recognized internationally for its influential books in art, poetry, art practice, and critical theory. Enrique was born in Cuba, raised in Spain and Puerto Rico. He studied applied physics, literature, and art at Cornell, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's a fellow of multiple institutions, including the Huntington Library, Art Museum and Botanical Gardens, the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities, and the Robinson Jeffers Tor House Foundation, and he serves on the board of trustees of Otis College of Art and Design. Enrique, welcome to the MO podcast.
Very happy to be here. Very happy to be with the two of you.
Great. Enrique, today I think we're going to talk quite a bit about the 2 exhibitions that you've got recently, one at the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Cuba and one at the Hispanic Society Museum and Library in New York. Before we dive into those, do you think you could tell us a little bit about your personal history with Cuba and what it meant to go back there for this exhibition?
Sure. So I left Cuba when I was 7. I moved to Spain, but I think in order to understand that exit properly, it's important to know that at that time you couldn't just leave. You have to ask for permission to leave. My father was granted his first, and then for the next 2.5 years, we just waited for the exit to come. And the reason why that's a really important time is because that is the time that then I end up using for another exhibition, the material from that time. And also because that was a terrible time. It's an in-between, a liminal space. We were neither gone nor in Cuba, so to speak, because every conversation was about our exit. So I left in 1972. We moved to Madrid and lived there during Franco. And we then eventually, in 1977, we moved to Puerto Rico. So that's sort of my trajectory for that time. So one more thing to add, sort of when we left, we were the first one to leave from my family, Cuba. So we left everybody behind.
It's intense. Was it, how did the show come about in Cuba, and sort of, was it an easy decision to go, or was that a complicated thing emotionally for you?
it was very complicated. In 2019, I was invited to do the Havana Biennial, and that was my first visit to Cuba in 46 years. So that was complicated enough to go back to Cuba and install a piece right for the Havana Biennial right in the Malecon, which is the part right by the water. So when I got invited to do a museum in the National Museum in Cuba, I'm the first exile that gets invited to do this. So it was in some ways a great honor. Like normally that would be an unqualified honor, but in the case of my family, everybody was opposed to it. Nobody wanted me to do it. They felt that I was betraying my family, who went through a lot as a consequence of the revolution. A lot of the Cuban collectors and so on, not a lot, not everyone, but many were not happy with my decision. Miami, Miami is a very sort of particular place that people feel very, for many good reasons, personally involved with the situation of the revolution, and many of them suffer a lot because of it. So for all those reasons, community reasons, personal reasons, family reasons, it was very difficult to decide whether to do it. On the other hand, I was surprised in 2019 how much the Cuban community was interested in my work, and how much they felt I was a Cuban, even though for the most part I have not conceived myself as working within the circle of Cuban art. That's not how I thought of my work. Nonetheless, the Cubans felt very much connected to my work. So that was some sense of responsibility and interest in having some engagement with the Cuban community, and ultimately return to the country in which I was born and be able to connect to that whole tradition in this museum that contains a lot of the history of Cuban art. Felt also very important historically for me, for my own history. So at the end, I decided to do it, despite how difficult the decision was. And of course, it was a very good decision.
When you say that the Cuban community in Cuba was very interested in you and in your work, how did that come across, and how is that interest different than, or let's say maybe a broader question is, how does that community, in your experience of it now having returned, how is the sensibility very different from the Cuban expatriate community, and how does that shape their relationship to your work?
I mean, the Cuban community, our community, not just in the visual arts, but literature and so on, is a very sophisticated community, which is very involved in what's happening in Europe, very aware of what's happening in the United States and Latin America. So they knew my work through articles, reviews, the web, never really in person, because I never actually exhibited until 2019 in Cuba. So they were conversant with many of the ideas that were in my work. And interestingly enough, to your question, is in many ways my work in the United States, especially at the beginning of my career here, was thought of being very strange, that I would have, for example, continental philosophy references or any of that. People were not used to thinking of Latin American artists with those kinds of influences. But in Cuba, this is not strange. Certainly a whole generation, multiple generations raised with, conversations about Marx and conversations about Hegel and so on, were extremely connected with those ideas. So a lot of my ideas, also influenced by Latin American literature and poetry, were very normal and familiar in Cuba, in a way that in some ways they're not in America, and they're pretty much not common from a Latin American artist in most places. So that was an easy connection. And I think for this patriot community, I never lived in a community like Miami that there are so many Cubans. I mean, when I was older, I went to spend some time in Florida, but not growing up. So I think the concerns of many of the Cuban artists living in Miami were somewhat different than mine, including those who came from Cuba. And I think many of including my family, many of the people who left Cuba had a lot of resentment and lost a lot because of the Cuban Revolution. So there's always that stigma of any engagement with Cuba will be seen as participating or betraying certain ideals, participating with the revolution and betraying certain ideals of the expatriates, of the exiles.
I'm curious. You lived there. You lived in Florida for a period of time. You made your studio there for a period of time before returning to Los Angeles. What was your relationship to that kind of Cold War anti-communist sensibility of the Cuban community, and did it have any kind of relationship to the way you thought about your own art practice and your own intellectual development?
And my own experience is more complex because I of course left as a kid. We moved to Spain and then Puerto Rico, and came here for college. So in some ways, my losses were all personal, in the sense, family members, traditions, language to an extent. But I didn't have to feel like the losses that adults have of the house they built, or the the career they develop over years with difficulty and having migrated. I think that if somebody were to force me to migrate now and leave everything behind and not take it with me, nothing, not even a ring or something, that would really make me a very different person than it would make my children, who, they haven't built anything yet. So at the same time, when I was a kid, we all used to say this thing, which I think is very true. I said, if you are a thinking person who reads in Latin America and you're not a Marxist in your teens, then you're not thinking very much, because when you're in Latin America as a whole, and you see in some ways the influence of multinational corporations in Latin America, and when you see those kinds of things, it's very difficult not to feel that something needs to change. In Latin America, in many parts of Latin America, there's a lot of corruption, often, if not supported directly, indirectly by aspects of the American corporate structure. So it's very difficult not to feel anger and resentment against that. So certainly for me, that was part of my experience. As you get older, those feelings evolve because complexity grows as you get older. But yeah.
I wanted to ask one more thing. Sorry, Joey, I don't mean to keep preempting your questions. You mentioned that the sort of relationship to Cuba, the relationship to that history, for you personally, is one that's a little bit more about personal loss, about the loss of family members, loss of language, and the travel to Spain and to Puerto Rico. And here I want to tie this specifically to the exhibition at the Hispanic Society. And it strikes me that show is something about trying to recuperate some of those personal relationships, or recuperate some of those personal connections. And I'm curious about how deep that goes. So for people who haven't seen the show, part of the thematic revolves around this portrait of a little girl by Diego Velázquez from the 17th century. And am I right, Enrique, that this is the first time that work has traveled to the United States on the occasion of
No,
the
no,
show?
it's owned by the Hispanic
Oh,
Society.
it's owned by the Hispanic Society. It's owned by the Velázquez is owned by the Hispanic Society, right? And so this portrait of a little girl is the image that you had on the cover of a notebook that was given to you, if I'm correct, by your mother. And the notebook was a kind of diary or a personal notebook where you had lots of bits and pieces of your own personal history written down, and events that were taking place in your early life. And then those have been reproduced to a certain extent in these large scale paintings that are part of the exhibition at the Hispanic Society.
A little bit, not exactly like that. So while the show at the Museo de Bellas Artes was personal in the engagement. The work itself was not as personal. But as you point out, the Hispanic Society work is extremely personal. So what happened was, when I was approached about doing it, the first person to talk to me about it was Felipe de Montebello. He said to come and do this exhibition. The coincidence is I don't have too many things from my childhood. Obviously, moving from country to country, you don't keep too much. But I have a couple of different objects. One of them was a notebook, which is my first grade notebook. That's where I did dictations and all the things you do in first grade. And the other thing that I had was my father had kept the letters that I sent to him from Cuba when he was living in Spain. And those letters that I sent to my father, which are in the same exact period as the notebook, which is the last year and a half when we were in Spain, in Cuba, which is also that liminal time we're about to waiting for an exit. So that's really that period, that year and a half. That period is the focus of the exhibition, and this is the most sort of personally exposed, if you like, show that I have ever done, because it's using my personal matter, my family matters, the letters that I sent to my father as the foundations. That is not the end of this show, but that's certainly the beginning of the show. It begins on that.
So I'm curious then, sort of like how the show in Cuba, even though the work is not as based upon personal histories or as evident, has work in it that's not as let's say exposing of your own personal history. How much was it that show in Cuba kind of incident for, or a generative for wanting to do a more wanted to do this show at the Hispanic Society as this kind of as this more personal tour of your own history?
In some ways, the appearance of these two shows back to back is almost a coincidence on the calendar. But once they were there, and then there's a third show that comes at the Venda Museum here in Los Angeles that I will do in the spring of 2025, which completes this sort of Cuban trilogy of sorts. So, but while initially the two shows seemed to have nothing to do with each other, once they were both back to back in the calendar, I could not help but to connect them in some manner. So, and they're connected not only emotionally and thematically, but also technically. A lot of the process of working that I developed for Cuba, then I use for the Hispanic Society. So in Cuba, the exposure was one of, in relation to my contemporary history of who I am. Now going back to Cuba and doing this, feeling part. When you walk to see my exhibition, you have to walk through the entire museum, so to speak, and see all of Cuban history, and then see my work as the contemporary version of that tradition. It was very powerful for me in that sense, transformative. Actually, it was very strange to give talks, for instance, and not have to say where I'm from. All of a sudden, I was Cuban in Cuba. But the Hispanic Society is a revelation of the aspirations, not only of my aspirations as a hoping to be exiled, but of an entire generation and of my family. And even though many of the letters are covered with oceans, there are still fragments of what was written in there that is for the world to see, including a note from my mother on top of one of the letters and so on. So in that way, there was a lot more risk, not to mention the risk of putting my work next to Velázquez, which in itself is a very threatening idea. And I created a small exhibition next to mine that functions as a comment on my exhibition, where I also included Goya and El Greco. So there's all these artists that I have always admired, who are, of course, some of the greatest artists that they have been, and putting your work around them, it's a humbling experience, to say the least. So that was a different kind of exposure. And then the fact that Hispanic Society is located in a mostly Dominican Latin community, the fact that for many of the people coming there, for many people coming from the community around it, they will have their own version of my story, but my story was familiar. A story of living, story of distance between families, of seas separating you from who you used to be. So all those things were things that even if people were not familiar with art, for instance, they knew the personal story. It didn't have to be explained. So that was also a significant difference for the Hispanic Society exhibition.
Enrique, when you talk about all of the people who didn't want you to do the show in Cuba, it feels like not doing it was the easier decision. And so I'm curious about both why you felt it was important to do, and, as the first sort of exiled artist to be given a show like that in Cuba, what did you want to accomplish? Like what was important to you going into that show in terms of, what you wanted to represent?
So you might enjoy hearing this anecdote. So my family has never done a family reunion. It's not a Cuban thing to do a family reunion where you get everybody. But my brothers and I decided to do one in the summer of 2022. And we gathered the entire family there in Miami, and it was incredible. And we saw everybody. And then we stood up to thank everybody. And I decided, not yet understanding what I was about to say to them, that I was have been invited to do this show at the National Museum. In the normal circumstances, when you announce that to your family pride, National Museum, well, it's like I drop a grenade at that family reunion. Not a word was saying. Then people came to me, "You can't do it." Oh, every aunt that I have was like trying to convince me for different ways. So of course, the sense of the black sheep of the family that after all they have gone through, I'm going to do this. So countless text messages and things like that came afterwards. At the end, I had to do it for my own reason. But what I decided to do was to cook into the exhibition, to include into the work itself some of the polemic implied in that return. So it was very important to me that all the problematic situation, the history of my family, the aspirations of Cuba, and everything else that I understood about the Cuban situation in general and my family situation in particular was somehow part of the exhibition in very subtle ways, in the very way the paintings were constructed, in the way I chose the imagery, and so on, and in the way they installed it. So that was my compromise. It's not a compromise. That was my way to negotiate um, all the different callings that I have for this exhibition. The importance of doing it, the respect for Cuba and the Cuban community, the questions that I have, the respect for my family, and at the end of the day, trying to do works that were meaningful in themselves. So that's how I resolved it. And only time will tell if it was a good resolution or not.
What did you get a chance to really visit with the artist community while you were there?
I did. I did. It was when before the opening they do this thing in the downstairs at the museum, where they put a microphone and some presentations are done, and people actually walk together to the opening, which is something very different than anything I have done. So when I saw the crowd, it was unbelievable. I mean, I got all emotional and stuff because I couldn't believe that all those people had come, Cubans, to come and see me there. And then I met some during the biennial, but I met others, and I had, felt that very quickly I was embraced by the community. I spoke to some young artists. I also spoke at the National Art School and had very nice conversation with both the teachers and the students. Saw their work, walk around the studios, and saw that. Visited some of the places that show work. I was as immersed as you can be in just a 1 week visit. Um, and I felt that I had a sense, a small sense, but a sense of what was happening in Cuba. And as you know, when you visit, sort of the school, ISA, the sort of the big art school in Havana. When you visit that, you kind of feel like you're taking the pulse of what's happening in the country, because you see what faculty are thinking about, what students are doing, and my talk there was very well attended, which is not always the case in a if you give a talk to an art department in America, people don't always show up, but here everybody does, and the questions were exciting and interesting, and with it, that was very very exciting for me.
What did you get the sense they were most interested in hearing from you about? And I'm also curious to know what you think of the state of the art in Cuba is after that visit to the schools and seeing what the students are up to and what the faculty are up to and what their conversations entail.
Let me start from the end of your question. I think the Cuban community in Cuba, and the students in particular, are quite sophisticated. They're very aware of what's going on in the world, but at the same time, more sort of, for example, the presence of pop and irony sensibilities that exist in the U.S. and Europe is not so present in Cuba, which is also very interesting to see. Very interested in sort of conceptual dimension of work, while at the same time feeling an obligation to traditions, and like everybody, not everybody, but a lot of the students there really can render and can draw and can do things, even if they're not doing it, even if that's not the strategies they're using. So that was very interesting. And I think what they were interested in my work was something that I usually have to talk a lot, or explain here, or bring it to the forefront, because when people here see my work, they tend to imagine I'm a painter, and I think of it as a total work of art involved in different dimensions. And interestingly enough, in Cuba, I didn't have to explain that. I think they got that. They were also interested and curious at how one of them, a Cuban, can have an international career. I think one of the challenges for the Cubans in Cuba is a sense of isolation. There's not a lot of, even though they are conversing and looking at images and so on, it's almost a one-way dialogue, right? So they take things in, but they don't get to put things out too much. Even though there are some artists that live in Cuba that exhibit in the United States and Europe, is a small number. And when they do, the idea of being sort of have a wide recognition is not that common. So they appreciated that. And I think in some ways, when I am in the United States, I never feel that my career, even with students, that my career is an example of what perhaps someone else might be able to do. I don't carry myself with a sense of, oh, look what I've done, and maybe you can do it too. But quite often I feel very unaware of those aspects of it. But when I was in Cuba, I felt a sense of responsibility, which I had not felt here before, of saying this was not easy to accomplish, but this is what I can do, and not trying to say, oh, this is impressive or not, but said, it can be done. It's not impossible to do that. And that was something I never felt before in that way, even while talking to students.
It was part of that, and do you believe that for a Cuban student of art or Cuban artist who wants to achieve something significant with their practice, that they need to leave Cuba?
I think that's a very good question and a difficult one to answer. I think for the most part, Cuba has an active community, and heroes and people they respect and people they idealize and all that within Cuba. But they're all conscious of the fact that that is an island, and a small island, and certainly that the idea, for example, of some very ambitious projects are not really quite possible. Financially, for one thing. I mean, one of the things that I saw when I was at the art school is how little materials were available. even just the material limitations already determine somewhat what you're able to do. So while intellectually they were ambitious, in practical terms, it's very difficult to accomplish some projects that are very ambitious. You would never think of a project like a laugh or a liaison or something like that being done anywhere in Cuba by a Cuban artist. So I think that that plays a big role. I think in Cuba. I think while they appreciate what has happened in Cuba, and they appreciate the opportunities they have had as artists, they do feel somewhat, and this is just my interpretation, they feel limited in terms of being able to do projects around the world and do things. Um, and I think, to add to that, and I think that sometimes, not everybody, but a lot of Cuban artists have come to the United States, have made a lot of crappy work, and in order to make a lot of money once they get here, and they have sort of banged them out and make one after another. And on the one hand, I detest that part of it, and on the other hand, I understand it, because when you have been compressed for so long, and with so, with not any food to eat or whatever, and then also you come here and you can sell things and people want to buy it, it's hard to resist that.
Right. You can't blame someone for chasing abundance after having been in a place that is subject to such scarcity.
Right. Yeah.
There was one other, and then we can move off this topic, but I'm so curious, and you opened the door to this earlier. What does a art student in Cuba understand about your work intuitively that a painting student in the Yale MFA program does not?
Another good question. My intellectual and emotional education was really crafted through, for the most part, Latin American literature in my teenage years. A certain idea that there's no opposition between being committed to the ideas of social justice, self-development, and so on, and a certain kind of artistic practice that is not ironic or not cynical, and so on. That those things can coexist. I mean, Latin American. I think it was Mario Vargas Llosa that said, we would love to be able to write like the Americans can write, which is not involved with politics at all, but we can't afford it. And that, I think, in some ways, that education was very important to me, and so was the connection of that education to philosophy and those ideas. So I find that when I went to Cuba, many of the ideas and many of what I consider to be relevant concerns were shared by the Cubans. And say in the Yale MFA, I think that from my experiences of visiting these programs over the years, there's a tendency to see what is trending in the discourse, what the Whitney Biennial is doing, what's happening. Is frankly, is quite heady in a way, but heady is different than intellectual, in the way that would describe some of the Cuban concerns, and everybody's one degree of separation from a successful artist in the New York art scene. So I don't know many. I had never, not never, I have met some, but very few MFA students in the top graduate program that do not see themselves participating in the market ultimately. Well, for the Cubans, the market is like saying, someday I will be vacationing in Tahiti. It doesn't really, it's there, it exists, but they know that for the most part, that would never be part of their lives. And I think that creates a completely different approach. Well, if you take the market out, what work do you want to do? And this is a question that no MFA in America uh, tends to ask themselves. So if there's no market and no one is going to want to buy your work, and you might get one exhibition every couple of years, so now you can work by yourself, essentially, not by yourself, but in a community. But is then what work do you want to do? And that's a different question that I know than the one I think we ask ourselves here.
Enrique, I want to jump to another area. So I guess something I'm interested in is, you have a very multidisciplinary practice. And I think, the obviously the saying is like, jack of all trades, master of none. And I feel like that doesn't apply to you whatsoever. It feels very much like you're kind of a master of like many things, which I just think is like so difficult to pull off. To me, looking from the outside, I feel like, all of the areas of your practice, whether it be writing, sculpting, painting, like it feels very much like they all sort of sit on equal footing. And again, I think that's not something that very many people are able to pull off. Most people, I think, sort of have one thing that is the core, and then they have other things which could be maybe viewed as like side projects. And again, that just doesn't feel like your practice to me. Would you agree that sort of that you feel? Do you feel like all of these different disciplines are sort of sitting on equal footing? Do you feel like painting is the main thing, and then how do you think about keeping all of these different disciplines at this really strong level? Like, what's the key to having everything that you do, be at sort of this mastery level, as opposed to having one thing and then side projects?
Well, I appreciate that you feel that they're that you have a good sense about them. Since I was a teenager, I was interested in many disciplines, in many fields. My problem was that I would have liked to be a writer, a scientist, or artist. And part of the reason of why that was is because my primary concern wasn't those things themselves. I was interested in understanding the world in some manner. So I wanted to approach it to attack that in whichever ways I can. And that's what took me to philosophy and through all these things. I started as a painter, as an apprentice for a painter. But over time, some of my thinkings of philosophy and some of my sense of what writing can do led me to sort of look at a more all-encompassing project. So I began to do sculptures and photography. And because I think that I want to maintain always an attitude of being a beginner, just starting out. I don't mind taking on, for example, when I have done projects in photography, all my understandings of photography is conceptual. I don't really know any technical sense of photography. And I don't mind that. I don't mind that photographers are sloppy or that I don't know how to use the camera or something. So, but it is important to me not to dabble. And here's a contradiction, advocating for the idea of being a beginner, but a beginner and a dabbler are two different things to me. So I think that for some artists who I respect, they will just be painters or sculptors or writers. But for me, that option was not available. I was interested in all those things at once. And I wanted to create a practice, which took a long time, that those things, as well as teaching, as well as social engagement, were part of it. And at first, I didn't know how to do it. At first, I felt discombobulated. When I was in grad school, I felt like, why can't I just be interested in physics like my physicist friends? Or why can't I just be interested in writing like my writing friends? I wanted to be that guy in many ways, but I just couldn't. And then over time, with a lot of work, I managed to kind of put all the parts together, and I have shaped a career for myself that one of the virtues it has for me is that it has brought in everything that I liked. Dave Hickey, I don't know if you're familiar with him, it's a critic. He told me once that all the successful artists he knew were successful because they never left anything that they were interested behind and always found a way to incorporate it into their practice, which is interesting because I think as artists, we're often moving through stages and leaving things behind. But I think there's something to what he's saying. There's a sense of always manage to bring something back, maybe not the totality of what you were doing, but some aspect of your concern there. So for me, I have created a studio and a practice that its main purpose is to support that multifaceted engagement with the world.
Let me do a
Go
little
ahead,
bit of a
Jonathan.
follow-up question. So Enrique, you've mentioned that, and I know this about you, given our long history together, that literature and philosophy are two very significant resources for your work, both your painting, but your larger artistic practice, and even in the writing that you do. Um, so one curiosity I have is, since you've already mentioned it a couple of times, there is a history of and a canon of great Latin American Spanish language writers and literature that I would say is firmly established in the kind of larger pantheon of what we think of as a kind of global literature or heritage. But you don't have that in Spanish language philosophy in the same way. Whereas you have a kind of dominant strain of German language and English language philosophy that I think is fairly prominent. Um, German for sure, if you think to Heidegger and Wittgenstein and the entire legacy of kind of early 20th century and mid 20th century philosophy. Why do you think there is no Spanish language philosophical legacy equivalent to the literature of Spanish language writers?
I mean, there are some philosophers like Ortega Gasset that are significant and prominent, but it's
But
a,
it's
it's
not
a
the same.
very good, it's a very
Not the same, right? I mean, it's a very
yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I have pondered these questions a lot, because especially being a physicist, because physics is another thing that is very northern concern. Of places like Germany and places like that. Why is it some traditions seem to do well in some areas and not others? I mean, I think in partly the kind of philosophical concerns of the West in post-religious, because there are a lot of um, Catholic philosophers from early of medieval times and late, but say in the modern tradition, was all dominated, especially as we understand in America, mostly looking at say places like France and Germany, or Germanic countries, um, and with some maybe Scandinavian influences there, and I think that the dominance of a certain kind of sort of perhaps thinking that emerged in those countries dominated so much the process of the enlightenment and so on, in a way that it didn't quite happen in the same way in in Spain. I mean, for one thing, you know, uh, just before the enlightenment came about, Philip IV closed itself to the rest of Europe, and I think that prevented some of the conversations to happen of the Enlightenment. And I think things like art, for example, were closed off as well. If Velázquez was working on the Philip IV on that closed Spain, even though he traveled to Italy and so on. But there was already enough porosity and enough history of an art tradition in Spain, particularly during the ecclesiastical period, that allowed that to remain. But um, but if I were to offer a reason why that is, I will offer that as a possible place to begin asking questions. What happened with the Enlightenment in Spain? Um, and then once the philosophical tradition established, by these countries is set up, um, it's in some ways quite different than what was happening in the Americas. That is difficult for them to participate in the same way. However, the influence of those traditions, for example, someone like Borges, been so influenced by Schopenhauer, for example. Or you have Pablo Neruda and sort of very, very, very concerned with some of the philosophical strains in Europe. A lot of the writers were concerned with what was happening in these ideas. But it is a good question, and the same question exists. For example, why is it that there's a lot of biology and medicine in the Spanish countries, but so little physics? I mean, I'm sure somebody listening to this will tell me 100 examples how I'm wrong, but not you don't hear too much of physicists in coming from
That's right. And on the
these
face of it,
places.
it's got to be right. I'm sure there are counter examples, but the physics, of it, I could more easily explain with probably access to capital, centralization of financial resources and academic resources in certain locations that allowed for the sort of aggregation of talents in certain places and the mobility of people versus the immobility of certain kind of experimental regimes and everything. If you think of the second half of the 20th century requiring some a proximity of practice, experimental practice next to sort of theoretical practice. I mean, you can sort of see that, but you know, philosophy presumably should be able to take place anywhere that someone has access to books and translations, right?
But
And
maybe this used religion. The Catholic Church was very, very powerful, and not just powerful in Spain, but very connected to government, very connected to institutions. So I think any outburst of the kinds of thought that lead to philosophy will be subsumed into theology, and particularly Catholic theology. And I think that probably um, has something to do with it, because if you think about the, the sort of the German tradition, not to mention the French just yet, but the German tradition sort of, in some ways, is in some sort of polemical relationship. Even when you have some concern with God still in Kant or Hegel, you are pushing against with the introduction of the concerns of reason and so on, which are
right.
not really participating in the Catholic theological tradition. So I think that the Kants and Hegels and Schopenhauers and Kierkegaards of Spain were probably working for the church.
Interesting. So only in a kind of countries where the Reformation had taken hold to some extent across kind of Northern Europe do you get a loosening up of the church's hold on kind of intellectual oversight, and that is a flourishing, whereas a literary community can translate those ideas into a whole different output that has less of a that may be of less concern to the church, let's say.
That would be my ignorant
Yeah.
guess.
No, it's interesting. So to follow up on that, how does your own, you know, Catholicism, let's say, even though I know that that's not your religion, but how does the sort of Catholic heritage emerge in your own practice, do you think, and your own thinking?
Well, I had the misfortune, I suppose, of having a problem with the church since very early on. So I walked out of my first communion at 11, and that basically set up a search for what to fill that void with. So I still had some of the concerns, sort of the sort of Wittgensteinian idea that I'm not religious, but can help to look at life from a religious point of view, where the questions of mortality and values and ethics were so important to me. But if I was not able to apply, like many of my family and so on, the religious answers to my questions. So then I went out into the world to try to find what else can fill that void. And I think philosophy and literature and science became my ways to fill that. So they became, and ultimately art became, a replacement for religion. It played the role that religion plays for believers. And in fact, my approach to art, when I talk about it, and you know this because we have talked many times, but the way I approach art and the way the reason why I dislike so much art is because I look at it with that desire to occupy in my life the role of a guide, not to say a religion, but a certain clarifying force of the ideas of how to live life better. So I think that's what happens. Mine was a strange, I don't know if genetic or what was it, that misfortune. I sort of extricated myself. I didn't need to be excommunicated. I did it by myself to get out of the Catholic Church.
But it's interesting that extrication leaves behind the void that still is the mark of the kind of Catholic worldview, or not the Catholic worldview, but of the worldview for which the Catholic religion and the Catholic teachings are themselves a kind of fill, right, or a kind of perspective
Sure.
on trying to answer certain types of questions. And so, but it does, it's not in the good Hegelian sense. It is not, the negation of that religion in your own work leaves behind the trace of the thing that then is being reconstituted in your own art practice.
Yeah, and right, and this will connect us to the other conversations we're having. One of the things that is different between religion and the way the arts are often treated in the West is that religion is all encompassing at all times. So even if you only go to church on Sundays, it should determine the way you treat your kid or the way you act when nobody's looking and so on. So religion is always, belief and faith are always determining the way you move through life. While many people in the art world have claims, or they make didactic work, or they do this or they do that, but really that is really confined to their art practice. In the rest of their lives, their art practice doesn't necessarily dictate how they should live. They do art and they live. But to me, the two things are one, they are absolutely bound in the same way it would be as a religious person. So I think you're absolutely right that I extricated a series of beliefs, but not the need. I am still, in some ways, in some sort of Catholic orbit of believing that there is some sort of value system that should be in place.
Enrique, I want to ask you one last question, and then we have what we call the more opinions section of the MO podcast, where we just have some fun questions we like to ask at the end. But before we do that, I think there's like a lot of artists who, they just make images that, maybe are just beautiful, or, they've got some meaning to them, or some sort of thought that goes into like the content of it. But for certain artists, it can be quite clear what it is and what they're trying to say, and what, what the motivations and inspirations were for the work. I know that you spend a lot of time, reading, and all of these things inform your work, but I feel like a lot of that is probably not clear or understood by the passive viewer. So I'm kind of curious, like, how do you think about sort of making art that has so much behind it, that maybe isn't immediately clear to the viewer, and sort of what is your relationship to the different types of people who would see your art, and sort of who is it for? Is it for the person who will read the texts and really get into it? How do you feel about the passive viewer, when so much of what you're trying to say is not clear to them?
Joey, I love that question, and it's a really important question. And I have always believed, and every year that I lived, I believe it more, that the role of intelligence is to get itself out of the way. Like if you imagine like looking at the world through a window, and intelligence being that window should be clear, should not be dirty and so on. And when I see somebody that shows me how intelligent they are, that to me is like a dirty window. I can see the world always through their intelligence, always through the stuff on the window. And I think that the role of intelligence and learning is to make fine distinctions, pointing clearly at things, highlighting nuances that may not be apparent at first, and then bringing that back with that in a way that removes all the mechanism of acquisition, which is intelligence and the learn, everything that you have learned, which is one of the reasons why the people who move me most, the writers that I found most interesting, like when I hear, and I'm not going to mention names, although recently I've been thinking a lot about pompous writers, but writers that everybody think, oh, he's so smart. I mean, I'm repulsed by it. I find it quite problematic when somebody pushes away any kind of engagement with life and with a certain kind of emotional relationship to life because the imposition of the so-called appearance of being a genius or intelligent, and at the same time they're basket cases in their personal lives. And I think that comes out of this idea that you can live two lives, one as a genius intellectual and another one as a basket case. And I think that the reconciliation of that comes with insisting that intelligence and what you read and what you think are all at the service of something rather than itself, or rather than impressing anybody, or rather than sort of blowing people away with how much Foucault have you crammed in the last 6 months. So to me, when I do my work, it has, as you said, many things have influenced. There's some poets that nobody have heard of, and so on. But I use those things and I use those ideas to help me see life clearly. And if in fact I understand it clearly, or clearer than I could otherwise, then I ought to be able to reveal that. Now, that being said, the visual arts, I mean, the arts in general, I spend all my day thinking about it and spend all my life thinking about it. So it's somebody that spends the whole day doing something else, say, being a hedge fund manager, and then comes and looks at my thing for 5 minutes and it's not interesting to them. What should it be? Because my role, while I'm saying that the importance of all that learning and trying to be intelligence just to move out of the way, but at the same time, I am trying to work at the edge of my capabilities and reveal something new to myself. So necessarily, there is a learning curve to that. In the same way that, if I spend my whole day doing physics, I can explain what I'm doing, but really only somebody who is really engaged with it will be able to understand the fine distinctions that are present in there. So there is a tension between the desire to remove pomposity and intelligence and obvious examples of intellectual erudition out of the work, and making sure that the work is connected to life, and at the same time acknowledging that when you're working on a tradition that has been around for 30,000 years, you are going to be doing things that people, for the most part, are not interested in. And that's okay. Like, I think art is not about numbers. It's not like politics or something else. I think that most serious artists and writers are typically working with some audience in their mind, and the numbers of that audience are very small. Even if you see Art Basel having many people going, ultimately it's really very small. For me, I hope to connect with just a handful of people. If it's more than that, that's fantastic. And it's not out of elitism, although ultimately art is an elitist pursuit. I mean, there's no way to soften the blow of that. I can remove some of my interest and remove some of my knowledge, as I do when I'm painting, say, with my kids. But that is not very interesting for me as a long-term pursuit. So I'm not an illustrator. I'm not sort of a didactic artist who uses my work as messages, and I'm not a decorator that people will love what I do because it's fun. My work is not any of those things. So there is a tension always between making sure that the work connects to life, and at the same time doesn't oversimplifies itself so that it's part of some imaginary discourse or is liked by some audience or whatever it is. It's not that kind of thing.
This question is going to be also in a more opinion and maybe clarifying on the last answer that you just gave, but also is going to come off sounding totally pretentious. So apologies in advance. You're going to be stranded on a desert island, and you can only take with you either the collected works of Wittgenstein or the collected works of Heidegger. Which one are you taking?
That's a interesting question. I think that I would take Heidegger, although I love Wittgenstein. And the reason why that is, I think that the first day in that island, I probably will want to read Wittgenstein. By the fifth year in that island, I probably want to read Heidegger. It will give more,
because they're both philosophers of uncovering and disclosure, just like as you were talking about it, both about trying to get at a more accurate picture of the world, but they go about it through very obviously very, very different mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you break your Douthan coconut and you're eating coconut again and chasing some lizard around, I think the problematics of language and a certain understanding will not be that important. I'm going to want to know what Earth and world are as I chew on that lizard.
That's a great answer.
I think I would just pick the one that has the most paper because at some point I'm just gonna need to repurpose that. So
this would also then be Heidegger is a good choice, right? Because being in time is going to get you further in your needs there than the Tractatus or philosophical investigations.
Enrique, all right. So we let's wrap it up with the more opinion segment. So first, can you tell us about another person or project in the art world that you're really excited by? Something ambitious that you think is just really interesting. You'd like to give a shout out to the project or the person?
There's a lot of ambitious projects that I am amazed at the logistical involvement of them. For example, James Turrell brought in Crater. I mean, that's a very ambitious and logistically gargantuan engagement. But it's not something I think about day to day. The projects that I think about, for example, Marcel Brothaer's fabrication of an imaginary museum, seems to me there's such beautiful poetry on that and such attempt to do something that is not only operating at the level of a physically ambitious thing, but also intellectually ambitious. I also interested in sort of Joseph Boy's project of combining seamlessly teaching live materials, earth and myth and all of that. I'm sort of interested in that project. And I'm also interested in the project of Marcel Duchamp abandoning art, really. I think that that's an interesting project to me. That's one that is always right there next to me. And I know this does not sound like an ambitious project when you imagine why did abandoning art would be really an ambitious project. But there's tremendous ambition in something like that. But I would love to give you something contemporary that people can use. But most of the ambitious contemporary art projects, which I know many of them, are not that interesting to me. I think they're I find them ambitious and exciting in the same way I find ambitious and exciting the building of a major skyscraper, but it's not something I'm thinking about day to day. For me, there have to be some resonance between the ambition and the power of the work, and I think those examples I gave you are maybe more my line. Or some crazy project like Monet and water lilies at the end of his life. I think we don't tend to think of that as a project, but I think the attention and sustained engagement he did when he can barely see and kept working at this all the way to the end of his life, I think that's commendable. I would like to do that myself with maybe better vision.
I think when you talk about these projects that are super ambitious but aren't interesting, it's like it reminds me of so many bands whose music is like really, really complex, but like totally annoying to listen to and doesn't seem to have much musicality to it. It's like complexity for complexity's sake. Where they're just trying to like show off all the weird time signatures they know, but it's not something that you can move your head to at all, and not something you want to listen to over and over again.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and sometimes these projects are so complex. You need, 75 assistants, $20 million to fabricate it, donors and philanthropy, and putting all these people together. And then they don't end up with the Sistine Chapel, that which for me is what I would like to do. If you're going to get that, I think the Sistine, and at the end of the day, it's because the Sistine Chapel is that level of engagement at that complex of a level, and yet at the same time there's a personal resonance when you engage with that project beyond sort of, wow, this is big. That's that's what I want. And that complexity you're talking about is a way to shut everyone up. Oh, look how complex my thing is. Who cares?
That's a good segue into the second to last question we have, and that is if somebody gave you a $10 million budget to do something, a project of great scale, what would you do? What would you build?
I think if I had the opportunity to do that, I will hire a couple of people to get my small publishing house to be more substantial, because I think that there's a lot of great things that can be put out there beyond the preoccupation of trade publications, trade publishers, great poets, great thinkers. And I wish that I could give them more space in my publishing house to do that. I think that I would love to be able to do that.
Yeah, that sounds like a good use of funds. All right, Enrique, last question in the more opinion segment. If you could steal any work of art to have, for yourself, anywhere in the world, what singular work of art would you like to take and have in your personal collection?
Well, as somebody who is often thinking of stealing artworks, which I am, whenever I go to a museum, I shouldn't say this loud. There are many that I would like to steal. I mean, it's hard to pass stealing a Leonardo. I can imagine stealing a few of those. But I think if I was going to be, if you only give me a chance to steal one, I probably will steal Toilers of the Sea by Albert Pinkenreiter, which is right now at the Metropolitan. I recently gave a talk there, but I don't want them to think that this is a real plan, but it's there somewhere.
Hilarious. What is it about that work that excites you?
It's in some ways there's a certain clunkiness and a certain almost inarticulate quality to that Pinkenreiter, and yet so much luminosity and power come from it that the gap between the fact, it's just a little small painting with tar and not, nothing is particularly fancily articulated. It doesn't have the great draftsmanship of Giorgione or Leonardo or something, but there is such power and such promise and such melancholy and so much life in it that I would like to live with that work. I would like to live with that work, and I would like to take it along with the Heidegger to the island, and just be there with it. I think when you ask me that question, the first thing I think about is what is a good companionship? What is a work that I want to be accompanied with, as opposed to blown away by? And I think for companionship, I think writer is as good as any. I mean, Van Gogh is a good companion too, but writer is good.
Yeah. Awesome, Enrique. This has been super fun and totally different than any of the other episodes we've recorded so far. So yeah, really entertaining. And thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's great to speak with both of you. I love the questions, and
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We look forward to putting the episode out.